And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is a really interesting guy, AJ Jacobs. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's an author, a journalist, a lecturer, and ultimately a human guinea pig. He's written 4 New York Times bestsellers. He's given multiple TED Talks, and he subjects himself to these really amazing experiments, if you will, that becomes the basis of the book and the content and all that. He's obviously been on Oprah, the Today Show, and luckily the Colbert Report, Dr. Oz, and he has obviously lowered the threshold to agree to join us today. So welcome, AJ.
Well, thank you, Peter. An honor to be here.
Well, I should say it's a requisite that you've been on at least Oprah and Dr. Oz before I would even consider having someone on. So anyway, either
Well,
way.
yeah, those are the sort of the farm team for getting on.
Exactly. The opening act, if you will. So anyway, I'm really, really glad. I was looking forward to this one today because this is really interesting. You are quite different, right? The typical sort of model for authorship and thought leadership in the nonfiction space is stick to one thing and be that guy and continue to do it, and just expand on it. That's not you, right? So tell me about sort of what your process or methodology is to decide to go do something, and then how do you do it, and then develop content, and monetize it, and live it, and all that stuff.
Yeah, sure. Well, I try to find a topic that I'm passionate about, fascinated with, and I dive in headfirst and try to become an expert, and sort of a 0 to 60 in a year. Uh, so I knew nothing about religion. But I decided to live by all the rules of the Bible for a year and see what happened. I knew I was in terrible shape, so I decided to follow every piece of health advice I could and try all the diets and exercise
Okay.
and become the healthiest person alive. So the method is the same, but the topics are different.
So I got to ask one question: Are you now both biblical and healthy, or then it goes away after a year?
Well, I always keep certain things.
Okay. Okay.
So like from the Bible book, part of the Bible says that you have to grow a huge beard. So I did shave the beard. My
Okay.
wife made me, but there were things I kept from that. The sense of gratitude, that was a
Sure.
big thing in the Bible, and that actually was the topic of my most recent book. And from the health book, yeah, I mean, I no longer am training for a triathlon, but I do like to. I have a treadmill desk, and I like to walk
Okay.
while I write. So there are always things to take away.
So I love that it's driven by curiosity and passion, and then this is clearly the antithesis of theoretical. You're the ultimate sort of applied guy, right? Which is great because oftentimes we are exposed to things that are, wonderful at the academic or conceptual level, but you wonder if any of these people have actually done any of the things that they attest to be experts in. So let's sort of segue a little bit to sort of the business side of AJ. So you come up with an idea, let's call that sort of a startup. How do you sort of decide which ones are worth investing in? Because you don't want to take a year doing something bad or silly or not effective. So how do you let's first discuss sort of the idea selection process that you use.
Sure, sure. And I think that's a good thing to discuss because I always tell people that I do come up with a lot of ideas.
Right.
So,
Right.
but 99% of them are terrible. And, I think maybe that's a little worse than most people, but I think that is not an unreasonable ratio. I think the key to creativity is quantity, just generating tons of ideas, and some are going to stick, and some are going to fall by the wayside. By far, most are going to fall. So I definitely will carve out 15 minutes of my day just to brainstorm ideas.
Okay.
Turn off all computers, all iPhones,
Sure.
and generate ideas, and then go back and see which ones are worth pursuing.
But how do you do that though? Because if, like you said, if 99 out of 100 are just no good, it sounds like what you're saying is, well, you still need to generate those 99 because you'll get to the 100th. But how do you know when that 100th one is the one?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it is. It's the $64,000 question. I have a few methods that I use. One is if the idea is still in your mind a couple of weeks later, then you know it's got potential. I do a lot of uh, testing on friends and even on Facebook. I'll put an idea out there and see if it gets traction.
Well, but let's talk about that. So, oftentimes, and this, I think this is an amazing point because oftentimes people make the mistake, or I believe it's a mistake at least, to create in isolation. They've got this great idea, and they say, "Man, I'm gonna, go get the cabin up at the lake, and I'm gonna just dive in for 4 months and do this," and then they put the book out there, and it's a flop. But you're doing beta testing in real time, saying, "Hey, let me put it out there, and the world will tell me." Before I've invested a lot of time, right? So, what? Tell me about that.
I can give you a few examples.
Sure.
I mean, I try to test as much as I can. I test titles.
Okay.
My last book was about gratitude, and the original title was "Thank You All," but I thought that wasn't catchy enough. So I actually spent $100 of my own money to do a test on, I guess it was Mechanical Turk,
Okay, yeah, on Amazon, yeah.
and I put out. I had the idea of thanks 1,000
Okay.
because the premise of the book is I thank 1,000 people who helped make my cup of coffee. So the logo
Yep,
designer, the
right,
every little person. So and I did that and tested it against thank you all and sort of an A/B test, and thanks 1,000 won, and I was able to use that to go back to the publisher,
right.
actual hard data, and say, look,
Sure.
this is what people prefer. And then they were more willing to switch because otherwise they might say, well, we're experts here and we've done this for dozens of years. So that was one example.
Being able to actually quantify what often comes into a, an opinion or, choose your battles with your publisher or whatever, but if you can show them the data, it's kinda hard to argue with that.
Oh yeah, I find it very effective, and I have lots of friends who do it too with covers, with titles.
Okay.
But I also do it with the book itself. So say I have 15 chapters, I will send it out to a group of 20 friends with the instruction. Can you please tell me which five chapters you like the most, and which chapters you find the most boring? And then I'll do a sort of spreadsheet of what the reactions are. And if there are 10 people who say this chapter is boring, then I am probably going to cut that chapter.
Well, and I like the way you frame that question because you could give the same stuff out to 20 people and say, "Give me your feedback," and that may imply, "Just tell me good things," but you're sort of setting the table saying, "Listen, tell me what's good and tell me what's boring because I suspect some things I do may be boring," right? And
Yeah,
yeah.
that's exactly what I say. I say I know this is too long,
Yep.
and right, if you just say, "Can you give me your feedback?" then people I feel often get overwhelmed and they don't give you anything, or they just give you pat answers like,
Yeah.
"Oh, it's
It's
interesting."
awesome. Right. Yeah, right.
But yeah, make it specific, and this doesn't have to be for books. This could be for anything: a presentation, a PowerPoint, a
Sure.
speech. And so I do that as much as I can, and I find it incredibly helpful. And the important thing to me is the group,
Yep.
because you could give it to one person, but they could be an outlier. They could be
Sure.
someone with very specific tastes, and so I don't like to rely on just one person.
Well, I would imagine by 20, there's some diversity in there. There's different perspectives. There's different, whatever levels of education or different fields that they represent. So you have a nice little microcosm there. So this process has obviously worked because you have, is it 4 New York Times bestsellers now?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I want everybody to sort of just pause and sort of reflect on anything that AJ has said that you go, "Oh, no, 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 I'll do it my way." I mean, there's something to be said for this process and methodology, and I would also add and push back, AJ, if you don't agree, there's a sense of open-mindedness and humility and willing to be able to sort of pivot and go, "Oops, okay, well, just because it was my idea, it stinks," right? Tell me about sort of what it takes to sort of do that because I think that takes a lot of courage, and a lot of people get caught up in their own ego. Or
I love that you say that, and I do think, yeah, humility is important. Just because you came up with it doesn't mean it's brilliant, and certainly in my case, it isn't. And I actually, my first book was reading the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z, and I wrote a piece for LinkedIn on 5 business lessons from the encyclopedia, and one of them was just what you said: be adaptable. Don't be willing to pivot.
yep,
Uh, they didn't use that word back in the 1800s, but that is pivoting is so crucial, and there were so many historical examples. I mean, just one quickly was the Welch family that came up with right before Prohibition, and they came up with this non-alcoholic wine for churches, for non-alcoholic sacramental wine made of grape juice, and it was kind of a flop. But then one of them pivoted and said, hey, what if we try to sell it to kids as sort of this juice, this sweet juice instead of apple juice? And that's when it took off. So, time and again, there were these lessons in pivoting.
So that's good. So now I want to talk a little bit or have you share with us your journey and your experience, the underlying business model. So for you, there's authorship, there's speaking. Talk to us about how you've figured that world out because you've got a really interesting, quirky, very different way of putting content out. But now let's talk about how do you make a living?
Well, yeah, I make most of my living from two sources, which are my book contracts and speaking.
Well, let
And
me just call a time out there. So for most of you listening, I'm going to just state the obvious that AJ is an anomaly. Most people are not making their living from their book contracts. In many instances, people are funding their book contracts, be that self-published or even traditional today. So you're able to do
yeah,
that because you have a track record of incredible success. So I just want to make sure that everybody realizes, don't go out there with expectations of six-figure advances and
and I don't expect it to continue because the business is changing so much.
sure.
So it is quite possible my advances will drop steeply in the future, and I'm prepared for that. But
So you have advances in speaking. So talk about sort of the relationship there and the speaking world and the publishing world. Yeah, share with us anything you can that would be helpful.
sure, I mean, speaking, I love. I hated speaking in the beginning. I actually went into writing partly because I thought, well, now I don't have to be in public. And it was quite the opposite. You have to get out there and sell. So I've sort of forced myself to do it for so many years that I've started to love it. And
But let me ask you on that. So I remember years and years ago, 15 plus years ago, the first time I saw Malcolm Gladwell speak, he was awful. And then I was like, I was really disappointed because I was just so in love with the first book. And then I'm like, well, of course he would be. Let's think about what his life was like before. Introspective, maybe a little introverted, maybe not so social, whatever. And then luckily I saw him a year or two later, and he's one of the best speakers I've seen. So there's a different skill set of sort of living in your head and putting words on paper than sort of the antithesis of that as being, and ladies and gentlemen, here's AJ. So talk about that transition for you because that's not everybody can make that leap.
well, that is so true. And I didn't know he was a bad speaker, but that goes to figure. I think almost everyone is a bad speaker in the beginning, but forcing yourself to do it and getting out there and trying to be as conversational, I find what resonates with audiences is being as conversational as possible. I also try to give them takeaways because you got to think about your audience. The audiences that I've spoken, I do some corporate
Yep.
work. And I also, since I wrote a book about religion, I've spoken at many churches and synagogues and fundraisers. So there's that. And also colleges. And I always try to a mix of humor and practical takeaway. So, sort of the fun, but also the useful. And that so far has served me well, knock on wood. But another thing I had to teach myself was, and I still have to remind myself, in fact, I'm doing it right now, to remind myself to vary everything I'm doing as much as possible. So, vary my pitch,
Okay.
vary the speed when I'm talking. So, talk quickly and then pause, and then talk medium and pause, vary my tone of voice, vary my volume, so loud, soft, and that I think is so crucial to keeping people awake. Because if you just our brains latch on to what is new, so you've always got to sort of be surprising them.
Well, and you also want to sort of vacillate from more cerebral to more narrative to funny and just sort of mix up the. You don't have to be stuck in one lane because that's sort of
Oh yeah,
the that will put folks to sleep. So talk about the business side of speaking. So How have you mastered that? Because a lot of folks that I work with speak, and a lot of folks want to speak. When I say speak, professionally, right?
Right.
Share with us sort of what your journey's been like in terms of whether you're working with the bureaus or booking direct, and the type of speaking gigs you like, and what's that like? Because it's a very odd waters to navigate, if you will.
Yeah, no, and I feel lucky that I've gotten opportunities. In the beginning, I didn't. My first book was about reading the encyclopedia, and I did not get many speaking gigs at all. So it was only
Well,
when
because
I
was the
was
pitch that we would watch you would get up on stage and pick up the letter V and just read from it, or no?
that might have maybe that would
Okay,
have worked better. That
Victrola,
was
right?
the best things. I would save you the year and a half of reading by telling you the 10 best things or 10
Right,
best
right, right.
lessons. Media. And it wasn't hugely successful.
Okay.
I think the more practical the book is, the more that it can have takeaways that corporations or fundraisers
But
want.
drill down on that. So what might, so let's say I've got content out there, it doesn't really matter what the domain is. What are and this is, I think, the interesting bridge here. So I've got my content, the market that has their needs. How do I bridge it? What do companies want? What do they want to take away from a keynote that lasts maybe an hour or so?
Well, in my experience, it's that combination of entertaining,
Sure.
because they got to be entertained, but also they want those three or four takeaways that'll make their workers more productive or happier or healthier. So I've done health talks like Goldman Sachs. I did one on like how to stay healthy. And I guess from a purely cost benefit analysis, you want to be alive and making money. And I spoke a lot. I'm doing a talk to a bunch of CEOs about gratitude, and I'm going to try to frame it about sort of the benefits of gratitude, not just to your mental health, but again to the workplace. A happier, more grateful workplace is going to be more productive.
So you have to extrapolate actually from there's a plethora of information on why gratitude is beneficial to me as an individual, but you have to sort of expand the conversation to, and here's what a team that practices gratitude looks like, and here's what an organization that's more embracing of a grateful mindset, and what that looks like in terms of outcomes or how they serve their clients, right? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. My book was about going around the world thanking 1,000 people. So I can tell some tales of that and some funny stories. But also, I've looked and found data on how gratitude helps in business and found some case studies of companies where they wrote handwritten thank you notes to their customers and saw like double the retention rate. So
So
throwing
so
those.
tell me I think that's key, because oftentimes I've seen early stage keynoters where it's only one or the other, right? So if they're an academic, it might be data point, data point, data point, data point. If they're more, let's say, motivational, for lack of a better word, it's story, story, story. So how do you? It sounds like you've got a nice blend of, either a data point and a story that illustrates it, or the other way around, and why that's really way more powerful than sticking to sort of one of those.
Oh yeah, I think you need both. I think you've got to keep people interested with the personal story and the traditional things people like in stories, struggle and vulnerability and humor and things of that nature. But then you want to drive it home with a little science. So yeah, a combination of both is key. And of course, starting I think with the personal story is a good way to start. You don't want to start with the data.
Well, and how do you get to relatable? Because if nothing else, you're extreme, right? So, and I mean that in a good way, right? So most people might say, I'm feeling like a chunky monkey. I got to lose 20 pounds. So here's the things I'm going to do: not spend a year of their life, becoming best in class, or religion or whatever. So how do you? Because I think. Most people look at what you do and go, "Oh, well, that's really interesting," but I'm not doing that for a year. How do you sort of connect the extreme to the relatable?
Well, at least for me, it's that I am just a regular sort of I'm the stand-in for the regular American, and
Okay.
I was not in good shape to begin with. So they can follow my journey as I try to become in really good shape. And of course, they're never going to do all the things I did because it's my full-time job.
Right.
But I can, at the end of the books, I'm able to have, here are 10 things that you can do to make your life better. Sort of the takeaways, you
So
go to
because
these.
I've tried 100 or 1,000 things, I can give you the 10. So it's a sort of a time saver or a best practices or something.
That's exactly it.
Cool. Anything else for folks you sort of embarking on the speaking side that you would advise or recommend?
Well, I would say when you are writing a book, if you write a book, then definitely think of the audience that you are. Think ahead to what would a corporation or a college or an organization find useful in this book, and maybe tailor your book a little towards that.
Yeah, that's a great point because and even those markets, when you think about the speaking market, the college market is very different than the traditional corporate market is very different than the association market. So you don't have to necessarily design exclusively for one, but if you understand the buy side, and I think underneath the buy side, I think people earlier in their speaking careers get confused from the butt in the seat, the audience member, making them really, really happy, and not really considering, wait a minute, there's the audience, but there's a whole other constituent of the buyer, the purchaser, right? The person that owns that meeting and what their expectations are. And it's not that they're 1,000% different from the audience member in the seat, but they're not identical. Could you just touch on that for a moment?
Oh yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that yeah, the people who are going to be booking you are not the audience. It's going to be the HR person or the events person at the corporation. So yeah, think of them when you're writing, or not even when you're writing, but when you're crafting your message after you write. So when you're writing LinkedIn articles, maybe write a LinkedIn article that could just be turned into a speech. Something like the 10 best business. I have given a couple of talks on that, 10 best business lessons from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was on my LinkedIn article.
Well, this has been awesome. I could talk for hours, but given that we're running short on time here, I really appreciate all that you've shared with us in terms of the ideation piece and how you refine your ideas and how you put them out there. As we sort of wrap up, any nugget or two that you'd throw out at an aspiring thought leader or author that's ready to dive in deeper in terms of what to do or not to do?
Well, just to repeat that, some people are good at coming up with ideas in the shower or while they're walking, and occasionally that happens to me. But often, for me, I have to really sort of make an appointment with my creative side and just really block off a time to come up with ideas and give myself license to know that most of them are not going to be great.
Right.
So really being very disciplined, it's a little bit of paradoxical, but being very disciplined in your creativity.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and this has been chock full of really valuable information. Thank you so much, AJ.
Thank you, Peter.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.